The higher the tariff, the more likely it is to have them come into the
higher the tariff, the more you're going to put on the value of that piece, those goods, the higher people are going to have to pay in shops.
We are on the brink of a major crisis in global logistics that could overshadow all previous economic shocks. More than 200,000 containers stuck at US port terminals threaten to disrupt not only the entire supply chain, but also the very foundations of the global economy. Time is money, and in this case, time is literally crashing the value of goods, disrupting deadlines, and threatening millions of jobs. But what is behind this disaster? Why is the US on the brink of a logistics collapse, and what consequences could this have for the global economy?
In other words, pre-substitution, if we just continue as we are now. But of course, people will start to substitute. They will find other goods. And as the Christmas Tree Association said a moment or two ago, it's going to be very difficult to find substitution of many things that we currently get from China.
Imagine huge shipments, tens of thousands of tons of goods, including electronic devices, cars, medicines, and food, are standing still. Ports haven't seen queues like this in a long time. Ships waiting to be unloaded are stuck in the roadstead for months, and the ports themselves are overloaded to the limit. What caused this global paralysis? Labor shortages, the pandemic, old and inefficient systems? Or is it the result of decades of underinvestment in infrastructure?
Well, when you look at the kind of input Musk has been having into politics, there has been some polling done which suggests there is a strong dissatisfaction with.
It is at times like these, when the economy begins to crack at the seams, that political leaders come to the fore. Donald Trump, who has always criticized his government's economic policy, is once again in the spotlight. He accuses the current administration of inefficiency in dealing with the port problem. But what does he propose as a solution? How could his policies and statements affect the future of the US economy and global trade?
There are surveys like the Michigan survey, consumer sentiment, and it's a really worrying number because at some point these sentiment surveys feed into hard data of real consumer spending. And we know this from history and precedent, that's what happens. So when we see a number as bad as this one, it is only a matter of time, unless anything else changes that would suddenly make people more cheerful. Look at that chart. I mean, just look at it. Unless people suddenly become more cheerful, why would this not translate into spending? You see, that consumer lab, the lab from Yale, that number of 4,700, that is providing you don't start substituting goods.
Will logistics problems lead to another economic crisis? What price will the US pay to get out of this situation? And what lessons can be learned for the future of the global economy? Find the answers to these questions in our video.
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
Get ready for a detailed analysis of the most pressing issues that affect each and every one of us today. In this video, we will not only tell you what is happening in American ports, but also try to answer how this situation could change not only the US, but the entire global market.
The Chinese impression is that they are willing to at least negotiate, not necessarily on Donald Trump's terms, but to talk. But their impression is that the U.S. has not opened channels and not made an effort to open up channels.
The congestion at US ports is not just a temporary problem that makes the work of logistics specialists more difficult. It is a global threat that could trigger devastating economic consequences. More than 200,000 containers stuck at terminals are disrupting international trade, driving up prices and slowing down production. This situation has led to huge economic losses and left its mark on the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. But how did we get here? What led to such a disaster?
Yeah, you'll be surprised just how much we get exclusively from China. And Jim, I'm really curious to get your perspective on the White House's handling of this situation. Not so much the tariffs that have been announced, but this reporting that the White House, that officials have made clear to Beijing that they want Xi to ask for a call with Trump.
The port congestion began with years of neglect of US infrastructure and a lack of investment in port terminal modernization. Ports such as Los Angeles and Long Beach, once considered major gateways for international trade, faced labor shortages and outdated technology that was unable to handle current shipping volumes. As a result, containers have been stuck at docks, and the unloading process has taken weeks instead of days.
To allow that. So now you have the US president say, well, I'm not going to open those channels. China has to open them first. It's kind of ridiculous at the end of the day, because you are playing with the interests of American consumers, Chinese consumers, etc. The other point I would make about China's reaction today in not quite meeting the U.S. tariffs, 145% U.S., China goes to 125. And in Xi's statement, he says, we're going to 125 in response. That's as high as we're going because this is getting a little ridiculous, right? And that's both a signal to say we're not going to get caught up in this tit for tat to the degree that the president is.
But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The global pandemic has exacerbated problems in international logistics. Many ships were delayed waiting to be unloaded, and port workers, for obvious reasons, were unable to work at full capacity due to quarantine measures and the spread of COVID-19. Problems with factory closures in exporting countries also put pressure on supply chains. Countries that produced electronics, automobiles, and medicines were unable to ship their products on time. As a result, many corporations faced supply disruptions, which led to price increases and a slowdown in production processes.
Right now, 145 going up against 125. These are the tariffs between the world's two biggest economies.
And here's another number, 4,700, or about $400 per month. That is how much more money Yale's now estimating, the Yale Budget Lab, that President Trump's tariffs are going to cost average households each year. And with just hours left in trading, the Dow right now.
However, it should not be forgotten that this situation also has a political context. In recent years, tensions between political parties in the US have risen sharply, and logistics has become a target of harsh criticism. Donald Trump, who has previously claimed that the US economy is suffering from excessive globalization, has once again raised the issue of port congestion and accused the current administration of being ill-prepared. He argued that the problem was mainly due to misguided policies that prevented the public and private sectors from working in close coordination. He accused the government of failing to support emerging industries that could reduce the country's dependence on foreign supplies. According to him, this led to American ports being unable to cope with the huge volumes of container traffic, and the problem became catastrophic. Of course, this was not unanimously accepted, as accusations were leveled at Trump for his failure to understand the new economic realities when globalization can no longer be stopped.
But it's also an opening to say, okay, we're capping this for now, and that perhaps offers a way forward that we could begin talking about how to bring these down.
At the same time, the US began to develop new infrastructure modernization programs. In 2022, an ambitious plan was announced to modernize ports and terminals, including not only the construction of new ship terminals, but also the improvement of automated container sorting systems. However, this did not have an immediate effect. Real infrastructure modernization will take a lot of time, money, and effort. Problems with port congestion continued to accumulate.
We shouldn't be surprised with all that's coming out and all the worries about tariffs. It's not just that, it's the complexity of everything else as well. The changes within the federal government, the worries about job losses, the worries about a slowing economy, higher inflation, and eventually you get these
Labor shortages also played a role in the crisis. Port workers were largely dependent on migration, and when borders began to close due to the pandemic, many of them returned to their home countries. In addition, due to high staff turnover in an unstable environment, there were problems with hiring new employees. Even those who worked in ports experienced enormous difficulties due to congestion. Many shipping companies began to fight for the opportunity to transport their cargo through a limited number of ports, and rumors began to surface that the most tense situation would soon be in other parts of the country. This only exacerbated the situation, creating new bottlenecks in the supply chain.
Up. You're seeing that swing here going into the afternoon, up almost 650 points. But it was up and down there throughout earlier in the day. With us now, we have CNN business editor-at-large Richard Quest. We have CNN chief national security analyst Jim Sciutto as well. Richard, a key economic gauge, the consumer sentiment now at its second lowest level on record, going back to 1952. Why?
But what will happen if this situation is not resolved? The consequences for the global economy could be devastating. If port congestion continues, supply disruptions could lead to a global economic crisis. Commodity prices will rise and manufacturing in importing countries will slow down. This will affect all aspects of people's lives, from food to consumer goods and high technology. Countries with developed economies, such as the US, will face rising inflation, while developing economies that depend on imports will also feel the impact on their financial systems.
Lived in China. You've covered China for some time now. As we're looking at this question of who's going to blink first, with two very different political systems, what is your gauge on this?
Well, different systems, listen, one's a democracy, one is not. One's a single-party state, very much not a democracy. But China does have politics, and Chinese leaders do not want to be seen, we were talking about this yesterday, I believe, do not want to be seen as capitulating to America. That is not good politics for a Chinese leader.
The question of how to resolve this issue is becoming more pressing with each passing day. The future of global trade and the stability of the world economy depend on a quick and effective resolution of the situation. The entire global supply chain, from factories in Asia to store shelves in Europe and North America, must be redistributed and redesigned. Possible solutions, such as closer cooperation between the public and private sectors, the recruitment of additional labor, and the introduction of new technologies, must all be part of the strategy. However, to prevent this from becoming another utopian dream, determination and a willingness to respond quickly are essential.
Wolf, they did fall on deaf ears, but it's just the latest example in the really day by day, the deepening trade war that is underway between the United States and China. Yes, we are learning that U.S. officials privately behind the scenes urged China to not retaliate. In fact, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been saying that publicly all along, warning countries to not retaliate. Well, those warnings have fallen on deaf ears, particularly with China, as they raised their tariffs to 125%. The question now is which side is going to blink?
In conclusion, port congestion is not just a local problem, it is a challenge for the whole world. How these problems are solved will determine not only the economic situation in the US, but also the future conditions for all international shipments. Modernization, reforms, and political will are the factors that can change the course of events. But time is running out, and it is not working in our favor.
Including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, of course, I'm going to respond. And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs. ABC's chief White House correspondent Mary Bruce leading us off.
Today, President Trump side by side in the Oval Office with the head of the Irish government.
The congestion at US ports and disruptions in logistics chains have had a more devastating impact on the economy than might appear at first glance. Rising prices for goods, delivery delays, and massive disruptions to manufacturing orders have made life difficult for businesses across the country. The difficulties caused by this have affected not only large corporations, but also small businesses and, of course, end consumers. All of this has had far-reaching consequences for every segment of the economy that depends in one way or another on the timely delivery of goods, whether it be the automotive industry, pharmaceuticals, or even grocery chains. One of the first signs that port congestion could lead to serious economic consequences was a chain of supply disruptions. The problems faced by US ports meant that many companies were unable to obtain the goods they needed on time. Moreover, there was a sharp rise in prices for all goods that were at risk of delays. Electronics, cars, furniture, and household goods all began to rise in price due to constant delivery disruptions. Many companies, from car manufacturers to retail chains, began to report losses amounting to billions of dollars. The American auto industry, for example, saw a sharp drop in production. Some brands, like Ford and General Motors, said their factories were shut down for weeks because they couldn't get the parts they needed, like microchips and assembly parts. As a result, car production fell by 35% within a few months, leading to higher prices and longer waiting times. The pharmaceutical industry deserves a special mention, as it came under pressure from a shortage of medicines, with deliveries delayed and some drugs no longer reaching pharmacies. Was this solely due to logistical disruptions? Of course not. In response to the crisis, many companies began looking for ways to restore normal supplies, but then trade tariffs and international politics came into play. Tensions between the US and China in the trade sector continued to escalate, which also played a role in prolonging the resolution of the logistics problem. Tariffs imposed on Chinese goods further slowed down the delivery process, increasing the cost and delivery time of goods from Asia to the US. Many large companies were faced with a choice: wait for long delivery times through ports or try to establish alternative routes, such as transporting goods by rail or using air transport. But this presented another problem: high transport prices, a shortage of space in cargo planes, and increased logistics costs. In this situation, Donald Trump, who decided to return to the political arena, sharply criticized the actions of Joe Biden's administration, accusing it of inefficiency in solving the problem of port congestion. In his statement, Trump pointed out that the situation with American ports is not just a logistics problem, but a direct consequence of the government's incompetence. He argued that the ports should have been modernized years ago, and that the current administration was too late in starting to upgrade the infrastructure. The ports are stuck in the last century, Trump said, stressing that without radical reforms in the logistics industry, the US economy would continue to suffer from falling growth rates and rising prices. However, his opponents argued that even if the government had taken action in advance, the COVID-19 pandemic would still have had an impact on the economy and the labor market. However, Trump drew attention to another important issue: America's unjustified dependence on foreign supplies and the lack of efforts to develop domestic production. In his view, the solution to the problem lay not only in modernizing ports, but also in returning manufacturing capacity to the US. This statement resonated widely and sparked a wave of criticism from politicians and experts who argued that Trump's idea of bringing manufacturing back to the country was too ambitious and unlikely in the context of global trade. In reality, although the US president and his team have taken steps to address the problem, the process of infrastructure modernization is slow. Under the new Infrastructure Modernization Law, large sums have been allocated for the renovation and automation of ports in 2022, but the timing of the project's implementation remains uncertain. Many experts believe that simply increasing port capacity will not solve the underlying problem of the overall deterioration of the global logistics system. Equally important was how international trade responded to these problems. Many of the US's partner countries began to look for ways to minimize the impact of the crisis on their economies. Expected high commodity prices and longer delivery times became a new reality that everyone had to face. For example, in Europe, discussions began on the possibility of creating more efficient transport corridors that would bypass congested American ports and make greater use of rail and air transport instead of sea transport. This undoubtedly led to increased competition between countries, which caused additional concerns in the US. According to some experts, the global economy was restructuring, and those who had previously been dependent on America began to look for new supply routes. The recovery process after the logistical disaster will be long and difficult. Cargo management systems, which are fragmented and inefficient in their current state, will require radical changes. The US authorities must not only solve the problem of port congestion, but also review their approach to foreign trade, strengthen domestic industry, and establish more effective cooperation with international partners. In other words, the crisis in the ports is only the first sign of what may follow in the global economy. The measures proposed to solve the port congestion problem and improve the global logistics situation remain a key issue being discussed at all levels of government and business. US ports are experiencing not only physical but also institutional pressure. First and foremost, the existing infrastructure needs to be modernized. Several steps have been taken over the past few years to address key bottlenecks, but real modernization remains a task for the future. According to plans that were supposed to allocate more than $1 trillion to upgrade transportation and logistics facilities, the problem is still far from being solved. This is especially true given the growing labor shortage, old and obsolete cargo terminals, and insufficient process automation. And even despite the government's efforts, the steps actually proposed have not delivered the desired results. US ports continue to face staff shortages, a lack of modern technology, and chronic delays. First and foremost, improvements to port and terminal infrastructure should have included expanding throughput capacity through the introduction of new automated systems, modernizing warehouses, and improving conditions for workers. However, the implementation of these projects has been slowed by political instability and lengthy bureaucratic procedures. For example, in January 2023, work began on the creation of an automatic container tracking system at one of the largest US ports, Los Angeles, which was supposed to speed up the process of delivery and unloading. However, it became apparent that there were insufficient funds and qualified specialists to fully implement this project. This resulted in months of delays, while the cost of shipping goods to the US continued to rise. Even 2 years after the project's launch, the new systems still do not cover all operations, and many containers are still sitting at terminals. In response, the US government announced emergency measures to speed up the process of restoring normal port operations. One of the first solutions was to launch a temporary labor program to unload containers and work with storage facilities. This was a step toward partially stabilizing the situation, but it did not solve the main problem: the lack of long-term solutions for infrastructure modernization. Meanwhile, large companies such as Amazon and Walmart continue to struggle with rising logistics costs, which are leading to higher prices for products. Many entrepreneurs, especially small and medium-sized businesses, are unable to cope with the increased costs, which in turn hinders economic recovery. In addition, despite government promises to speed up decisions on port congestion, no concrete and clear long-term strategy has been proposed to restore international trade. This leaves many questions regarding the country's foreign trade and economic security. There is a sense that the problem has been addressed in a hasty manner, without a clear model for overcoming the consequences at a deeper level. Problems such as the mismatch between transport volumes and available infrastructure still require significant investment, but these have been given lower priority in light of other policy decisions, which experts believe is exacerbating the crisis.